Full house today.
Full house?
Full house. Jeff and Cece. Got
Ooh.
Eli in the house. And we also got a new dude in the house. His name's Gio. Gio, what up? Part of the crew. We've been doing some cool things around here at the Ironsides podcast, and those would not get done without guys like Eli and Gio. So shout out to those guys from 8482 Media. They're killing it for us. And we also have my sidekick, Rue, the dog, who's a little restless right now because she's in heat, the poor thing. She's losing her mind.
Poor bitch.
So we're going to try to keep her in one place today. Warm-ups.
Warm-ups.
I want to talk about warm-ups today. There was a question that came out actually on the fitness floor. It was like, what's the best warm-up for this particular routine or this particular exercise? If I'm going to be lifting weights today, how should I warm up? Versus if I'm going out tomorrow for a run, how should I warm up? And I was like, okay, so tell me what you're doing now. And the first thing the person started in with was just like this list of movements or basically exercises. And I was like, okay, that just kind of gives me an idea of where their mindset is. And I think it often defaults to like, what movements do I have to do to count this as a successful or a productive warm-up?
Mm-hmm.
So part of the thing is I think you got to find out why somebody is, why is a specific warm-up important for a person? And the better question is why do people want specific warm-ups for a specific activity? Does that even matter? And most people listening to this would probably be, of course it matters, dude. And my question would be then like, why does it matter? And so maybe getting our heads wrapped around like, what's the importance? First off, let's define what a warm-up is and what the importance of a warm-up may or may not be, because I think there's some misconceptions to what people think it is and what it will do and not do. So maybe we just talk about kind of like, how would we define a warm-up?
Well, obviously we want to raise core temperature, right? That's always going to be kind of a defining factor in warm-up, but the way in which that you do it, there's a bunch of modalities. If you were to go and Google warm-up for something where you're just going to see cardiovascular stuff, mm-hmm. jogging, running, mm-hmm. jumping rope, arm circles, stuff like that, right? Where when we talk about warm-up, or I think about a warm-up, it's what movement am I about to do? Where are the limiting factors for myself within that movement? And what are some dynamic warm-up or, movements where I'm taking the tissue through its full range of motion, rotating, sliding, gliding, depending on whatever structure I'm working with, mm-hmm. and trying to bring back, for lack of a better explanation, functionality of that area that's either not, quote unquote, firing, to get all of this stuff more
lubricated.
Yeah.
Lubricated and more, the CNS literally being more aware of that area. A lot of these areas they don't have good awareness in. So a good warm-up should allow you to have to deal with a compensation, right? And you doing the opposite of it, and basically retraining yourself right then and there to hinge better, squat better, whatever you're about to do that day. But there's a lot of nuance that goes into that as well.
Yeah, key takeaway for me there was just how much you just put into that answer, which was very cerebral in a sense. And it was really about being mindful of what it is you're supposed to be doing. What am I mm-hmm. trying to get accomplished mm-hmm. here? So, that was sort of a definition plus an explanation of what the warm-up is. When I think of warm-up, I think of like, okay, there's a few components that, let's just break this down really simply. There's a few components that come to mind for me. What am I trying to get accomplished here? Well, I'm trying to prepare myself for whatever the activity is that I'm about to do. Again, and you mentioned, whether it's lifting or running or cycling or swimming or jumping, playing basketball, whatever it is, like I need to be prepared. So there's a psychological component that comes to this or comes with this. I think if you're, depending on where you just came from, like in your day, were you just sitting at work all day long or being stressed out at work or getting out from behind the wheel of a car? Are you a shift worker that, was on an assembly line somewhere, or you're in law enforcement and, you worked all night and you're making the trip into the gym on your way home. There's a lot of components that go into the psychological factors, I think, and that being like, okay, first off, I have to take myself out of wherever I was mentally, mm-hmm. psychologically, emotionally, and now put myself into this new situation, which is my workout, which again, could, for some people is, very performance-based. For other people, it's very therapeutic or, longevity-based or whatever. I just need to get my head wrapped around that. So there's a psychological or mindfulness component to this. The other thing I think is really important that maybe people miss in this is just the cognitive awareness that's happening. Like, okay, I need to get these things done. And you were just saying, I think you did a really good job articulating that, Jeff. Like, what am I doing today? What is my plan? How am I going to execute my plan? So you think about warm-ups, I think that's a component that gets left out a lot. It's like people are rushing in or they're coming into the gym, they're hitting that routine of the warm-up, whatever it is, and it can be really mindless versus being mindful. Yeah. So that's one major component I think that gets left out in a warm-up. So if any kind of warm-up for me needs to have a psychological preparedness piece to it, getting my head wrapped around what I'm about to be doing, why I'm doing it, and how I'm going to approach it from start to finish. Because I only have, let's say, an hour to work or whatever it is. I want to make sure I'm being as effective as I can. You know, the other part is like this physiological preparation, which you were hitting on. There's neuromuscularly, like what is happening with the CNS and the signals that are firing from my central nervous system down to my brain or through my muscles, you know, and then back to activate certain things or downregulate other things so that I can perform this right. And then also like there's the cardiovascular component, and I think that generally is kind of what we maybe reach back to when we think about like warming up. Maybe when we were kids in junior high or high school or whatever, like the warm up was like jumping jacks and burpees and things like that. It was more of a workout than a warm up for my little fat body as a kid. Right? I was like, this shit sucks. Right?
Yeah, I guess that was actually a really good nail to hit on the head. Like your warm up should not take away from your workout, right? So like, yeah, your warm up shouldn't be this high intensity thing where it's draining you from what, you know, the big benefit is of whatever your main mover is or anything else down the line.
It should be doing the opposite. It should be like priming that, right? Yeah, so maybe thinking of the warm up as like a priming of the systems, right? Again, neuromuscular system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system. Practice your breathing. Be mindful of your breathing. What are you doing? You know, with your breath work through your workouts. People might think that's corny, but I've like even bodybuilders and powerlifters very mindful of their breathing while they're working out. First off, just open your mouth up and your nose up and breathe is, I think, the best place to start. But at the same time, they really think deeply about to where it becomes automatic. To, you know, making sure they're managing that stuff as they're going through their routine. So that goes for everybody. If you're not breathing right, you're not performing at your best. So again, neuromuscular, respiratory, cardiovascular type stuff. It should be affecting all of those systems. We can talk a little bit about how to do that. But one of the other things that comes to mind here is like, why are people warming up? I think there's some things that people think that it does, and things that think that it helps prevent or things like that. I think we could talk about and really, I don't know, maybe just peel back the layers on. So, I mean, yeah, I see you smiling. Cece, what do you want to add?
Yeah, because you're saying, so does warming up really prevent injury? And my whole thing was, we talked about this off air, was, you know, the basic analogy that I like to use, or I used to use with people, is it's like taking spaghetti that's in the wrapper, you know, when it comes in its wrapper still, a pound of spaghetti, and the noodles are all hard, and then the wrapper is like your fascia. And the spaghetti noodles are like your muscles. And it's, if you were to take the wrapped spaghetti and try to bend them, they're going to fracture, right? So my whole analogy was like, well, that's kind of like the body too. If you don't warm it up, then you go to bend it, then you might create micro trauma to the muscle fibers. Whereas if you were to take the spaghetti and put it into a pot of boiling water, it's going to cook the spaghetti, make the noodles more pliable. And so the same kind of idea with the human body and its muscle system. Warm it up and it'll become more pliable.
So let me just play the devil's advocate here. I think the question I would ask, is that really a fair comparison, you know, physiologically and anatomically? So, and let me just explain here. Your fascia, your muscle cells, those striations, as you know, being compared to the spaghetti, are never dry. However, they could be somewhat, I guess, static. They've been static for a long time, right? They're not sliding and gliding the way they might if we increase some temperature, increase some movement, increase some neural firing to those areas, wake up other areas of the body, because nothing works in isolation.
Mind-body connection.
Yep. So nothing works in isolation. So if I'm not just warming up my bicep right? Like the bicep works in conjunction with a lot of other muscles, and those muscles have to be ready to move in order for the bicep to function properly and all those things. So there's something to be said for getting things moving. I get that as well. I think more specifically, we're looking at joints and moving fluid around the tissues. We're talking about synovial fluid, and you mentioned the term like lubrication. Yes, as if we've been stagnant or sitting static, getting things flowing through can help put us in a position to be more lubricated for whatever movements that we're going to do. But again, my question is like, is that really a fair comparison? I think it's a good analogy for somebody to kind of like, oh, that kind of makes sense.
Kind of wrap their head around it.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. If we just get things a little bit moving a little bit better through, in this case, spaghetti with water or fluid, which is not too far off the muscle cell, right? We're pushing fluid in, pushing fluid out, increasing circulation. It's never really dry. Temperature, but it makes sense. It makes good sense. You're pushing more blood, nutrients, oxygen, fluid into these areas, and it helps them do the things that they need to do in terms of transporting in, transporting out nutrients, but also, again, we talked about turning on the neurological system. So increasing temperature can help with that as well. So yeah, I get that. Now let's go back to the preventing injury part. Like theoretically, that makes a lot of sense. But I don't know, there's a lot of science to support that a warm-up prevents injury.
But going back to what we talked about earlier with the warm-up, there's the cognitive psychological component. So making the intention as far as how you're going to be approaching your workout, whatever that workout is. So getting your mind frame or mindset around what it is you're going to do. I mean, so your warm-up can be that as well. Yeah.
So here's my point to this. Like this is for like the counter argument or the trolls for that matter. They're like, yeah, but there's no science that says that warming up actually prevents injury. Yeah, but there's no science that says that it doesn't as well, like right now. Like, and again, people could argue that, well, I've listened to a lot of like strength coaches for as an example, talk about, you know, like we've talked about the concept of foam rolling, and anecdotally say, hey, listen, all I know is since I started doing this regularly with my athletes, my injury rates are down. And for him, that means, and this is a top guy who works with the top NHL team as well as college teams in the past. He's a professor, but he's also a coach. And you know, he's look, I just know that since I started doing this, we have a lot less injuries. And my job is dependent on keeping athletes healthy, and their job is dependent on keeping them healthy. So I'm not going to stop doing this. It's like, for me, like, okay, so there's no injury that says that it actually does prevent injury. There's not a lot of science that we know about right now. It's been disclosed that there's aliens out there. There's fucking aliens out there, man. Like, they exist. Like, they're out there, right? So, like, I don't necessarily have to be like, be served up like, here it is for me to provide, to think that it provides some type of a value, right? So
if you're waiting for a study to come out, you're probably going to be late to the party, man.
Yeah, but I think anytime we start when everything is about science all the time, that limits us, right? And it takes away from what you were saying, like this psychological mindfulness component of what a warm-up can do in terms of putting you in the right place, the right frame of mind, so that you are fully switched on everywhere. That's the term I would use, is switched on and ready to go, right? And ready to hit the gas and whatever activity you happen to be using.
I mean, there's even a discipline. There's sports psychology, for God's sakes, right? It's all about mindset and visualizing and so.
Yeah, I think
and performance.
Going back to what I was saying, so like, what's next? Okay, so we covered kind of defining what a warm-up is, defining what it isn't. Maybe we actually talk about that for a second longer. Like, I was talking about, like, as a kid, you know, what was considered the warm-up before we went into whatever activity we were doing. I mean, it could have been the fucking golf unit, and we were doing burpees out on the blacktop, right? As jumping jacks and liners, you know, UCLAs, whatever you want to call them, gassers. Yeah, we were doing all that. Was the quote unquote warm-up. The warm-up should be a warm-up, right? Not a workout. And so it's relative to the user, right, if you will, the individual that's doing the warm-up, to what that may or may not look like. But there's several ways to get that, to impact that neural drive and to get that heart rate up and whatever. But some things to maybe walk away from, like, what should your workout kind of feel like? First off, it shouldn't feel like a workout, right?
What should your warm-up feel like?
Yeah, so I think I'm for me, and again, it's a little bit individual. I think it's based on fitness level and things like that. First off, I should feel no pain in my warm-up. So that's the first thing I want to put out there. Like, well, I remember going back to the burpees and things. One of the other things we started with when we'll talk about this is the static stretching. It always fucking hurt. Like, and I just thought that was normal. Like, it was supposed to hurt. Like, this is part of stretching and it's part of a warm up. And this is what my teachers told me and my coaches told me, whatever. So it must be true. I'm just not good at this, but I recognize this is the process I have to go through. So it should not hurt. Secondly, it should impact those systems that all the systems that we've already been talking about. So what should you feel? Like, what might you see? Well, first off, I might feel my heart rate come up. So my respiratory rate increases a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. My heart rate comes up a little bit so that I can feel, again, more blood pumping through my veins. And generally with the two of those things, that's a reaction to the work that I'm putting in. And so what I'll feel is an increase in temperature. I might get a little sweaty, not dripping sweat, not huffing and puffing, but I'm going to feel a little bit sweaty. I'm also going to feel areas of my body, for me, that I recognize are tight. For me, it's kind of like a test. Like I'm kind of feeling around like what's tight for me today. And any given day of the week at my advanced stage now, that could be a lot of different things. So I I'm kind of feeling around like, what was my workout the other day? How is that impacting me now? What are my long chronic things? Like, are they aggravated today? So do I need to spend a little bit more time, or more specifically, just be a little bit more mentally aware of how I'm feeling in this particular area right now, going into whatever my workout is going to be. Like, again, I've talked about it before. I have some gnarly back stuff. So some back issues. So if I'm working into something that's really going to emphasize the use of my lower back, I just want to, maybe I take a little different approach for today. If I'm feeling extra tight or I'm feeling pain, more pain than usual. So those are things that I want to get out of a warm up. So I'm kind of switched on at a lot of different levels, a little sweaty, heart rate's up a little bit. And usually I'll start to feel kind of like the feel good hormones, if you will, start to get released, like, all right, we're in it, like I'm feeling a little bit more excited. And this is not with pre-workout or anything like that, right? This is just like, okay, I'm ready to roll. Like I'm in it. Yeah. My music's on or whatever's on in my head. I'm focused. I'm not distracted by what else is going on. That's warm up period for me. I don't know if you guys have anything to add, like things that come up for you?
I'd say it's very similar. There are times that the movement component, as far as through ranges of motion for, let's say, my workout in the gym specifically, I might take a little bit more time with just getting my head wrapped around what it is I'm going to do. So if I'm tired, if I'm rolling out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to get in here, I might just jump on the treadmill and walk and get some blood flow going before I actually get into some more specific movement patterns. Just because, getting up that early can be a challenge sometimes. And depending on, how I fueled the night before or how I slept and whatnot, that might just be a really critical component. But yeah, I'd say my warm up is very similar to what you just said. And then going on top of that, doing some build sets for the specific exercises that I'm going to be doing. So if I'm going to be doing a back squat, then I might do some dowel rod PVC back squats or overhead squats, just working on my range of motion, getting my ankles, my knees, my hips, in flexion and plantar flexion or dorsiflexion. So, and then maybe sitting into those movements and then not just keeping it strict vertical, but actually sit in it and then move side to side a little bit, and really just feel my feet planting into the ground. So, I'll do some build sets before I get into my working loads.
Jeff, I've seen you do some different things. We've talked about it several times on the show, just in terms of, some myofascial type work.
Yeah, so I'll just keep it real brief, but for an example, like let's say if I was bench pressing and I've got like some bicep tendonitis, right? The front of my shoulder hurts every time I push. I'm going to warm up my lats and my rhomboids. So I'm going to practice pulling my shoulders back and down, retracting and depressing, right? I'm also going to go through some light banded movement to make sure my chest is activated and I'm not irritating that. Also part of that is taking the scapula and the humerus, the upper arm, through its full range of motion that I have that day, controlled, right? Trying to bring functionality back to the shoulder girdle. And then I'll come in, like Cece's talking about, I'll do some warm-up sets, right? I do not count these as my working sets, right? They're just to get the groove in. They're to get everything dialed in, make sure I'm locked, so you're not just jumping right into, the weight you did last week, right? Mm-hmm. And then for me, if I'm dealing with a shoulder issue, that's the way I want to approach it. So I want to make sure it feels good, because like you're talking about, your little checks and balances in your warm-up, like, oh, that's tighter than usual. Oh, why today is when I press up, even on the warm-up, I have this tendonitis. So I might change the workout up, right? You might add face pulls or something else that is working with the shoulder girdle in an exercise in conjunction with that before the bench press to, again, have those muscles a little more in mind when we go through the bench press. Just an example.
Yeah, those are great examples of, you gave the squat example, you gave the press or the push example. Before I even get there, like generally for me, there's a little bit more that goes into it. I just like to move my body through space. And so you could do that in a lot of different ways. People have these very specific movements that they do, or this little routine that they go through. I've done all different types of stuff, but I find, like, first off, this can't make up the majority of my day. Like, I have to get moving. So I have to pick the movements and the things that get me into the working phases as quickly as possible so that I can continue to move through it.
That's the biggest one right there.
Yeah. I also don't want it to be boring, right? So I will pick different things all the time. And they're going to be those bigger movement patterns, and I'm going to add complexity to them. So maybe it's a lunge with a rotation. So I'm lunging up and down the turf with some rotation, some side bending, some reaching, things like that to just put my body in different positions. That helps me kind of with that testing process, as I mentioned before, that feeling out process, like, where's my body tight today? What am I feeling? Gets me connected, again, with like where I am in space kinesthetically. So I'll just kind of move around. So like a lunge with a reach or a rotation might be something that I do. I'm going to move laterally every time in my warm up. So I'm moving side to side. I'm a lateral lunge. I may do as I come back up, cross over with the opposite foot with a reach over the top. So I'm going into like a side bend. That might be tough to picture, but I'm getting my body to move in all these different spaces, which then takes me into what you were mentioning, Jeff. Like, okay, that was a little tight there. I'm gonna spend a little bit more time here in the shoulder complex right now and just be really focused on opening this up as I'm going into maybe more of an upper body dominant type of workout for the day. The other thing that I will do is, and this has become more important for me as I've gotten older, is just to add in a little bit of more dynamic work. There's many different ways to do this. But after I've gone through all of this, to really kind of fire on the nervous system, more specifically what's happening in terms of firing on all the different muscle fibers that I want to be using. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be using them, but I'm trying to get everything switched on, is what might be considered a little bit of ballistic work or explosive work. Now people are going, you're not supposed to do ballistic stuff, in your warm-up or whatever, no ballistic stretching. Like back in the day, there were cherry pickers where you would stand up. Now you're looking at what was the tightest kid in his junior high school, probably, right? And we would stand up and you'd reach down, out in front of you, and you would bounce into this as you were driving your hands towards the ground, like in a bending position, like in a hinge position. No knee bending. And you would just try to get as far back behind you and between your legs as you could come up, and then you'd stand back up and you'd do it again. And we'd go through like these 5 counts. Each time you're supposed to reach further, and you're driving into the stretch reflex every time. I remember that being very painful for me. Like, I was like,
Sounds
oh my God, I'm so tight. Yeah. But like, I'll do like, here's a good way to maybe think about this. Like just a little bit of bouncing on the balls of my feet. Like shadow boxing would be a good way of looking at this. Maybe even a little jumping rope or
like
whatever.
Low intensity.
Low intensity. I'll do it on the turf. I don't do it for very long. I'll go for 10, maybe 15 seconds just to kind of wake things up from an explosive perspective, right? That is firing on all the neurons and things that in my neuromuscular system to get things awake in a little bit of a different way. I'll do the same if I'm gonna go out for a little run or something like that. Like I'll just kind of bounce around a little bit. I'll do a little skipping. I know that might sound weird, but if you've ever been if you've ever done like a track workout, this may sound very familiar to you, where you're doing some skips and you're doing some jumps and kind of bouncing around a little bit. You're really waking things up. And it will accomplish all the other things we talked about at the beginning in terms of hitting the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and the neuromuscular system. So just things to maybe be thinking about to change it up for yourself. So like if I'm going into both of your examples, if I was going into the squat example, maybe I do just a couple of standing jumps, right? Just to kind of work things up. I'm not trying to break any, vertical leap records here. I'm just like, I'm just going to jump up and down, hop up and down a little bit, warm up through. So everything from my toes all the way up through my skull is getting this signal. Like we're about to be anaerobic, we're about to be explosive, right? And in your example, Jeff, maybe I'm doing like some, something like explosive push-ups, a few of them, like on an elevated surface, like off of a squat rack bar or off of a bench or something like that, just to kind of fire things on. Things to consider if you're getting into more of your anaerobic type training. But it's also stuff that you could do in your aerobic training. Like, absolutely. I often get the question like, well, so what should the warm-up look like for the runner? Well, it depends on what kind of running you're doing, right? All of this depends, but you mentioned, somebody said the word nuance earlier. I think it was you, Jeff. It all depends on the person, what they may or may not be dealing with, environmental factors, as well as obviously exactly what they're going to be doing. But if I'm going to be going into a long distance run, like I'm not going to spend 30 minutes warming up or, even 10 minutes, doing something outside of my running. I'm going to loosen up. I might get into that bouncing action, that lateral lunging, that forward reverse lunging, just kind of open up, find out where I'm tight. And then I'm going to get into running. And I'm just going to use the first 10 minutes as my sort of warm up period. Maybe for that first 500 meters, I'm playing around with some lateral movement or cariokas or, high knee pulls or some shuffles or something like that to get my body moving in different directions. So I'm not just running in a straight line the whole time. But getting my body to kind of, again, in a very short period of time, just get it into the movement that I'm going to be doing for the day. And obviously that a big depends here is your fitness level, because if you're only running a mile right now, to spend a half a mile warming up doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're a 10 miler, right, spending, a couple hundred meters doing some different things outside of your, just running kind of makes sense, right? It makes sense. But so there's a depends piece there. So just some like things to think about as you're going into it. Again, I think people really wrap their heads around like, what movements do I have to do to improve my squat before or prevent injury and get the gains? Lot of depends here. I don't know what else on the warm-ups that makes most sense, or what you've seen, or mistakes that you see people make, or any of that.
I see a lot of people they just go through the motion. Yeah, and I can tell just because I literally teach this for a very long time, the mobility piece. People will be, let's just say 90-90. It's a very widely used mobility modality position. So you're in a 90-90, you're practicing your hinge. I see everyone using their spine, right? Some of these areas we don't want to go into. So it's just, you can be doing the movement, but if you're not doing it properly or working on the tissue that you're trying to target and you're actually doing a different motor pattern, but you think you're doing this movement right, then we're not getting benefit from that.
Yeah, so does it even make sense to do it? That's the thing.
These warm-ups need to be, and if you're not aware of yourself, you need to be taught. And then from that position, every time you're trying to achieve this, regardless of how it feels, I'm trying to get deeper. I have to move this. He says, move this structure, sit here, do this. You have to know all that stuff. You can't just, I did this type of position and this is the benefit that it gives me, because that is not true. Yeah,
it's the same as like expecting that doing a warm-up is going to prevent you from being injured. Like there's theoretically that there may be some truth in it, but
I'd say mitigation, not prevention.
Yeah, right? It's not fact. Yeah. It's certainly going to put you in a better position. I think we know that from a performance perspective. So if I can perform better, I may decrease my potential for injury.
For sure.
A couple of things that got mentioned here, maybe just in wrapping it up, is like in terms of what to do. So if I was going out, like I think this is what people want to hear, right? Like, okay, but today's chest day. So how do I make sure it's Monday, it's chest day. How do I make sure I'm warmed up there? And, we mentioned a couple of things, just moving the entire body to start. Mm-hmm. But if I'm going out onto the floor, I think you may have talked about this, Jeff, but so stop me if I'm repeating this, but you're going to make sure that your lats are engaged, right? So I'm going to make sure the antagonist move and agonists and antagonists are working together in this particular motion. So, before I do any bench pressing, I'm going to make sure, or chest pressing, I'm going to make sure I'm doing some rowing, right? And I'm really going to activate everything that's happening posteriorly before I'm trying to, really impact what's happening, anteriorly.
Yeah, because the posteriorly, that's what's going to stabilize you when you're doing your anterior work.
It pulls the bar in on the bench press, right? So when you're looking at that, it is extremely important. Everyone will think about warming the shoulders and the chest up, right? Where it's like, no. You need to work on what's going to stabilize the shoulder girdle and also what's going to help pull in, lock your lats, keep the bar in the proper bar path.
Bar path, yeah.
Right? There's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that. So
yeah, I mean, you look at it the other way around. If I'm going in to do a big pull day, big back day, I'm gonna make sure chest is activated, shoulders are activated anteriorly. If I'm going into my hinge day, I'm definitely doing some squatting. I'm definitely doing some knee extension to make sure that the things on the front side are activated to support the things that are on the back side, and vice versa. The last thing is, like, if I'm going overhead today, I want to make sure that everything down below that is warmed up and switched on, right? So if I'm going to be pressing overhead, there's a lot of things underneath where those dumbbells are going to be, where that kettlebell is going to be, or where that barbell is going to be, that you want to make sure are all switched on. So doing some pushing, doing some pulling, doing some rotation, doing some scaption work, making sure your hips, low back, lumbar spine, all those things are active and ready to go and mobilized, but so that they can stabilize for you in a proper position. Those are all things I'd be considering. So rather than think about like, what are the exact things I need to do, think about conceptually, what makes sense for me today. And I don't think you have to be an expert with exercise or biomechanics or physiology or anatomy or whatever to kind of get that. But I think the bigger pieces is move, right? Get your brain switched on, and I don't just mean that from like the neuromuscular, perspective, but get yourself ready to do whatever it is that you're about to do. And that's being mindful and being aware of what's going on. And then secondly, from the physiological or physical perspective, like what do you want to feel? Let's get the heart rate up just a little bit. Let's get the muscles warmed up a little bit. Let's get the body moving through space. And let's make sure when we walk into this, we haven't, we're not leaving a ton off the table, at the same time not spending an entire workout period warming up, which then turns into a workout.
Like 10 to 15 minutes max.
Yeah, max. Yeah, max. I think it depends on what you're doing and what you're going to be doing for the day. But like, if you're spending longer than that, like, what are we doing? Yeah. Is this a recovery day? Because that could be more like recovery exercise than a warm up. Another topic probably for another time. I think the last thing is like one of the bigger, I don't want to call it a mistake. I would just say just misguided things that we see people doing with their warm up.
Yeah, but I think it's also rooted in history, old school.
Yeah. And just going back to like my junior high school stuff. I remember my junior high schools, my 6th and 7th grade year. I had this freaking guy 2 years in a row. He got fired after that. He's an alcoholic. Showed up to school drunk too many times. Whoa. But the bottom line there is like this dude, like, he was an ex-Marine and he was treating us kids like we were little Marines. But the routine was the same every time. Not in 2 years did it change. And we started on the floor. We started basically by doing static stretching. Now, basically, scientifically now, over time, we know there's really little to no benefit. In fact, we're recommending that you don't do this.
More of a detriment.
Yeah, before you get into any kind of like a lifting exercise or any type of even running movement or things like that. And here's the reason why. What we're trying to do is going back to the beginning, switch things on. And static stretching starts to turn things off, right? We're starting to dampen the signal. We're shutting down the signal of a firing pattern. Like if you're getting into a stretch, right? I think you mentioned one, like the sprinter stretch or whatever, the hurdler stretch.
Oh, maybe that's what it is. Yeah.
On the floor. Yeah. So you got kind of one leg pulled back behind you on one side, the other leg's pulled or punched straight out in front of you. Your knee is straight, and toes up, and you're reaching for those toes that are out in front of you there. The old school hurdler stretch. and you feel that tightness or that resistance, what you're feeling is a contraction against that stretch. Your body is trying to say, hey, dude, yeah, hold on. We're not going there, right? Because for many reasons. One, we don't have that tissue extensibility. Two, there is a safety mechanism, right? Like if we go too far knowing that we don't have this extensibility and or you're weaker up the chain, there could be something else that gives, up that chain. And so it's call it, what you want, but it's sort of a defense mechanism. It's pulling back. So if you continue to send it that signal to contract, right? The body ultimately can only do that for so long before there's a latency period and it'll kind of shut down and it'll stop sending that signal. And that's when you can get quote unquote deeper into that stretch. Now, there may be a great time to be doing that type of thing, but not before you're about to get into a workout where you're going to, let's just say, really be challenging yourself with loads, speeds, dynamic movement,
muscle contraction,
change of direction, and any type of where you want controlled muscle contraction, where you can basically move and stabilize and actively stabilize forces. So, or external loads that are coming in from the outside. So I think, the general recommendation there is it's pretty much looked at unkindly on now to be doing static stretching before you jump in. And again, people kind of like, they look at that, this seems totally normal because they were taught that over years and years and years from whoever, or they've seen it, over years and years and years of their childhood. I mean, we've cut PE out of school, so I don't know, maybe today's generation hasn't seen that much, but...
There's no PE in school anymore?
It's not compulsory.
It's not compulsory.
Never mind.
So stay away from the static stretching in your warm-up. That could actually create propensity for injury rather than preventing it. Stick to more of the dynamic movements where, again, you're moving through space.